The sound of silverware clinking against plates filled the makeshift restaurant as Al Pacino sat across from two veteran actors who were about to die by his hand. October 1971, Filmways Studios in Queens, New York. The Godfather production had been shooting for 6 weeks, but today was different. Today was the day Al would film the scene that would transform him from a struggling theater actor into a movie star. The restaurant scene. Michael Corleone's point of no return, the moment when the war hero becomes a killer, when innocence dies and a monster is born. Francis Ford Coppola had been building toward this scene since day one of production, and everyone on set knew it would make or break Al's performance as Michael. Al sat at a small table in the corner of the fake restaurant, wearing a simple suit and tie, his dark hair slicked back in 1940s style. At 31, he still looked young enough to play the college boy Michael was supposed to be before the war changed him. But in 7 minutes, he would need to become someone else entirely. Someone capable of cold-blooded murder. Across from him sat Richard Castellano as Pete Clemenza and Abe Vigada as Sal Tessio, both veteran character actors who'd been working in film longer than Al had been alive. They were running through their lines quietly, preparing for the complex sequence that would involve hidden weapons, precise timing, and the kind of controlled violence that Coppola demanded for his vision of the Corleone family. The set buzzed with controlled tension. This wasn't just another scene, it was the scene everyone had been waiting for. The scene that would prove whether Al Pacino deserved to be in the same movie as Marlon Brando, James Caan, and Robert Duvall. The scene that would either justify Coppola's controversial casting choice or confirm the studio's worst fears about hiring an unknown stage actor for such a crucial role. Al closed his eyes, tried to center himself the way he'd been taught at the actor's studio. He thought about Michael's journey, about the weight of family obligation, about the moment when everything you believe about yourself gets stripped away and replaced with something darker. He thought about the gun that would soon be taped under the toilet tank in the restaurant bathroom, about the lives he was about to take, about the man he was about to become. Al. The voice cut through his preparation like a blade. Al opened his eyes to see Marlon Brando standing beside his table, wearing the elaborate makeup that transformed him into Don Vito Corleone. Cotton balls stuffed in his cheeks, silver hair slicked back, the kind of presence that commanded attention even when he wasn't speaking. At 57, Brando was already a legend. On the waterfront, a streetcar named Desire, the Wild One. He'd revolutionized screen acting before Al was old enough to understand what acting meant. His method approach had influenced a generation of performers, but lately, his reputation for being difficult on sets had grown almost as large as his talent. Marlon, Al nodded, his voice carefully neutral. He'd learned to be cautious around Brando, who could be charming one moment and cutting the next. Today, something in Brando's posture suggested this wouldn't be a friendly conversation. Brando pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited, his movements slow and deliberate in the way that suggested he was thinking about something unpleasant. The makeup made his expressions hard to read, but his eyes were clear and focused entirely on Al. "This scene today," Brando said, his voice carrying that distinctive mumble that had become part of his legend, "it's important. Probably the most important scene in the picture for your character." Al waited. He'd learned that Brando often spoke in riddles, building toward points that weren't immediately obvious. Around them, the crew continued their preparations, but Al could sense people listening, could feel the attention that always followed Brando wherever he went. Michael's transformation, Brando continued, from war hero to killer, from outsider to family heir. It all happens in this restaurant. In these next 7 minutes, you either become Michael Corleone or you prove that Francis made a mistake casting you. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Al felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his expression calm. This was familiar territory, he'd been hearing variations of this doubt since the day he was cast. Too young, too unknown, too much of a risk for such an important role. "I'm ready," Al said simply. Brando leaned back in his chair, studied Al with the kind of intensity that made grown actors uncomfortable. "Are you?" "Because I've been watching your work, and I'm not convinced you understand what this scene requires." The restaurant set suddenly felt smaller, more claustrophobic. Al could sense crew members pretending to work while actually listening to every word of this conversation. In the film industry, confrontations between stars became the stuff of legend, retold and embellished for decades. What do you think it requires? Al asked, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. Transformation, Brando said, his voice dropping lower, more intimate. Not just acting like you're becoming someone else. Actually becoming someone else. In this scene, Michael Corleone is born and the college boy dies. Can you do that? Can you kill someone in front of a camera and make me believe you've crossed a line you can never uncross? Al felt something shift inside him, a familiar stirring that happened when he was being challenged as an actor. This wasn't just Marlon Brando the movie star talking. This was Marlon Brando the craftsman, questioning whether Al had the skill to pull off one of the most difficult acting challenges in the script. I think you're a good theater actor, Brando continued, but theater acting and film acting are different animals. On stage, you project to the back row. On camera, you think to the lens. This scene requires you to think like a killer, not perform like one. Brando stood, his bulky frame casting a shadow over the table. I've been making movies for 25 years, Al. I've seen hundreds of actors who were brilliant on stage fail completely on screen because they couldn't make the adjustment. They couldn't find the internal truth that the camera demands. The criticism stung because there was truth in it. Al had spent years perfecting his stage technique, learning to fill theaters with his presence and energy. But film acting was more intimate, more psychological. The camera could see lies that audiences in the back row might miss. Francis believes in you, Brando said, but Francis believed in me too, and I've been disappointing directors for years. Belief isn't enough. Talent isn't enough. You need to be able to access parts of yourself that most people spend their lives hiding from. Brando moved closer, close enough that Al could smell his cologne and see the individual pieces of cotton that created the Don's distinctive jawline. In this scene, you're going to kill two men. Not pretend to kill them, not act like you're killing them. You're going to find the part of yourself that's capable of murder and you're going to let it loose. The words hit Al like a physical blow. He understood what Brando was really saying, that method acting wasn't just about research and preparation. It was about accessing genuine emotions and impulses that most people never had to confront. The question is, Brando continued, his voice barely above a whisper, do you have that darkness in you? Because if you don't, if you're just another clean-cut theater actor who's never been touched by real violence or real desperation, then this scene is going to expose that. Al felt his hands clench into fists under the table. Part of him wanted to defend himself, to list his credentials and his preparation. But a larger part of him recognized the truth in what Brando was saying. This scene wasn't just about technical skill. It was about finding something authentic and dangerous inside himself and bringing it to the surface. You think I can't do it, Al said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Brando smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. I think you're not ready for this role. I think Francis cast you because you look right and you're cheap, not because you can handle the psychological weight of what Michael Corleone becomes. The silence that followed was electric. Crew members had stopped pretending to work and were openly staring now. This was the kind of confrontation that could destroy careers or forge legends, depending on how it played out. Al stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. When he spoke, his voice carried a new quality, something harder and more dangerous than anyone on set had heard from him before. You want to know if I can access darkness? Al asked, looking directly into Brando's eyes. But before he could continue, Assistant Director Chuck Myers approached the table with obvious reluctance. Assistant Director Chuck Myers approached the table with obvious reluctance, his clipboard clutched against his chest like armor. Mr. Brando, Mr. Pacino, we're ready for the scene whenever you are. Brando didn't break eye contact with Al. Give us 2 more minutes, Chuck. Myers nodded quickly and retreated, sensing the tension crackling between the two actors. The entire crew seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve. Al remained standing, his dark eyes locked on Brando's. When he spoke, his voice carried a new quality, not louder, but deeper, more controlled, with an undercurrent of something that made everyone within earshot take notice. "You want to know about darkness, Marlon?" Al asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You want to know if I can find the killer inside Michael Corleone?" Al walked around the table, his movements suddenly different, more predatory, more purposeful. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Something had shifted in his posture, in the way he carried himself, in the way his eyes tracked movement around the room. "I grew up in the South Bronx," Al said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Not the romantic version you see in movies. The real Bronx, where violence wasn't something you acted, it was something you survived." Brando's expression didn't change, but Al could see he was listening more intently now. "When I was 14, Al continued, I watched my neighbor get beaten to death with a pipe because he owed money to the wrong people. Took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of watching a man I'd known my entire life turn into meat and bone and blood on concrete. The restaurant set had gone completely silent. Even the ambient sounds of equipment and crew movement seemed to fade as Al continued speaking. You think I don't understand what Michael's going through in this scene? You think I can't access the part of someone that's capable of murder?" Al's voice remained quiet, but there was something in it now that made people take instinctive steps backward. Al moved closer to Brando, close enough that only he could hear the next words. "I know what it feels like to want to kill someone, Marlon. I know what it's like to have that thought cross your mind and realize you could actually do it. Most people never get that close to their own capacity for violence." Brando's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't the theatrical posturing he'd expected from a stage actor trying to prove himself. This was something rawer, more genuine. "When I was 19, Al continued, his voice still conversational but carrying unmistakable menace, someone tried to mug me outside a theater in Manhattan. Had a knife, thought I was an easy target because I was small and alone." Al's hand moved to his jacket pocket, a casual gesture that somehow managed to seem threatening. "I didn't run. I didn't call for help. I picked up a broken bottle and I went after him. Not because I was brave, because I was tired of being afraid. Tired of being small. Tired of being dismissed." The transformation was complete now. Al wasn't just telling a story, he was becoming the person he'd been in that moment 20 years ago. His entire physical presence had changed, from posture to breathing to the way he held his head. "He ran," Al said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "But for about 30 seconds, I was ready to cut his throat. Ready to watch him bleed out on the sidewalk. And you know what the scariest part was?" Brando waited, transfixed despite himself. "How easy it would have been. How little it would have bothered me." Al stepped back slightly, his voice returning to normal volume but retaining that dangerous undercurrent. "So when you ask me if I can find Michael's darkness, if I can access the killer inside him, you're asking the wrong question." Al looked around the restaurant set, at the crew members watching with fascination and fear, at the cameras positioned to capture every angle of the scene they were about to film. "The question isn't whether I can find that darkness," Al said. "The question is whether I can control it once I let it out." Brando stood frozen, realizing he'd awakened something in Al that was far more authentic and dangerous than anything he'd expected. This wasn't method acting technique, this was raw psychological access to genuine violence and trauma. Francis Ford Coppola appeared at the edge of the set, sensing the electricity in the air. "Everything okay here, gentlemen?" Al turned to face the director, and Coppola took an involuntary step backward. Whatever he saw in Al's eyes made him understand that something fundamental had shifted in his lead actor. "We're ready to shoot, Francis," Al said, his voice calm now but still carrying echoes of what had just been revealed. "I think Marlon and I have reached an understanding about Michael's character." Brando nodded slowly, still processing what he'd witnessed. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think we have." Coppola looked between his two stars, sensing that some kind of crucial transformation had taken place but not entirely sure what had happened. "All right then. Let's make some movie magic." The next 7 minutes would become the stuff of cinema legend. Al took his position at the restaurant table while the crew made final adjustments to lighting and camera angles. But something had changed in how people looked at him, how they moved around him. The questioning glances and skeptical whispers had been replaced by a new kind of respect, tinged with wariness. When the cameras rolled, Al Pacino disappeared completely. In his place sat Michael Corleone, not the college boy who'd returned from the war, but the man he was about to become. The transformation was so complete that even the veteran actors sharing the scene with him found themselves genuinely unsettled by his presence. The scene played out with methodical precision. Michael's nervous energy as he prepared to cross the line from civilian to killer. His awkward handling of the gun retrieved from the restaurant bathroom. The moment of decision when he looked across the table at two men who trusted him completely, knowing he was about to end their lives. But it was in Michael's eyes that Al's true genius showed. The internal struggle wasn't performed, it was lived. The moment when innocence died and calculation took its place happened so gradually, so convincingly, that everyone watching felt like witnesses to an actual psychological transformation. When Michael pulled the trigger, when he executed two men in cold blood with the mechanical efficiency that would define the rest of his life, there wasn't an actor playing a role anymore. There was only Michael Corleone, crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. The scene ended with Michael's careful, controlled exit from the restaurant. No rushing, no panic, just the measured movements of someone who had discovered they were capable of anything. "Cut!" Coppola called, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and awe. "That's a wrap on this setup." The restaurant set erupted in spontaneous applause, something that rarely happened during filming. But this hadn't been just another good take. It had been something unprecedented, something that everyone present recognized as exceptional. Al remained seated at the table for a moment, slowly returning to himself from wherever he'd gone to find Michael Corleone. When he finally stood, he looked drained but also somehow more solid, more present than he'd been before the scene. Brando approached him, no longer carrying the condescending attitude that had marked their earlier conversation. "Al," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." "No," Al replied, his voice hoarse from the emotional intensity of the scene. "You gave me exactly what I needed. You pushed me to find something I wasn't sure I could access." Brando extended his hand, and Al shook it. "That wasn't acting," Brando said. "That was inhabitation. That was becoming someone else completely." "That's what method acting is supposed to be," Al replied. "Not just technique, but psychological truth. Finding the parts of yourself that match the character, no matter how dark those parts might be." Over the following days, word spread throughout the Hollywood community about Al Pacino's performance in the restaurant scene. Studio executives who had questioned his casting began talking about him as a future star. Critics who previewed early footage started using words like transformative and career-defining. But perhaps more importantly, Al had proven something to himself. He'd discovered that he could access the deepest, darkest parts of human psychology and bring them to life on screen without losing himself in the process. He'd learned to channel genuine darkness into artistic expression. Years later, when interviewers asked Al about his approach to method acting, he would often reference that day on the Godfather set. Not because of Brando's challenge, but because of what he'd learned about the relationship between personal truth and artistic performance. "Acting isn't about pretending to be someone else," he would say. "It's about finding the parts of yourself that match the character and having the courage to let those parts live on screen. Sometimes that means accessing parts of yourself you'd rather keep hidden." The restaurant scene became one of the most studied and celebrated sequences in cinema history. Film students would analyze every gesture, every expression, every moment of Al's transformation from Michael the war hero to Michael the killer. But for those who were present on set that day, who witnessed the confrontation between Brando and Al and saw the 7 minutes that followed, the scene represented something more than great filmmaking. It represented the moment when a young stage actor proved he belonged among the greatest screen performers of his generation. And it all started with Marlon Brando's challenge: "You're not ready for this role." 7 minutes later, Al Pacino had proven him wrong in the most definitive way possible.